I met Art in the early 30s. I met him in Chicago at the Three Deuces. And I was working at a radio station, WJJD and WIND in Chicago. And a friend of mine come over to me, and at that time I was playing piano with Jackie Gleason. And I had my trio, and I was destined to be, in my mind, a piano player. And a friend of mine came over to me and he says, I hope you're sitting down because I got a record I want you to hear. And it was a humoresque or St. Louis Blues, one of those numbers of Art Tatum. And I heard Art Tatum for the first time and I went into shock. I could not believe what I heard. And I quit playing the piano right then and there and went to the guitar.
He lived on City Park in Toledo. And when I was in Toledo in 1932, I lived right across the street from him. And he was about maybe, at that time, about 17, well, maybe he's a little old, maybe he was about 20 years old, 18. And he used to he used to buy all of Earl Hines' records, because Earl Hines was one of his favorite musicians. And when I first went there, well, I was musical director for Frank Terry's Chicago Nightingales. I was about 22 then. We used to play at the Recreation Ballroom, and every Monday night we gave a colored dance. This Monday we were playing this dance, and we had intermission, and I was getting ready to go out and get me a drink or something, and Frank says to me, he said, wait a minute, I want you to hear something. I said, what do you want me to hear? I was anxious to go get out. He says, I want you to hear a pianist. I said, oh, I've heard all the piano players. I heard Earl Hines, or Frank Hines, I heard Fats, I heard all these fellas. I don't need to hear nobody play now. And as I was going out, they brought this blind kid up on the stand, and he sat down. And as I reached the door, he made a big arpeggio on the piano and went into Tiger Rag on the piano. I turned right around and went back up there to listen to him play. It was just fantastic.
I gave up that night. I gave up the day I heard it on the record, but I went down to hear him that night. He says he's appearing live at the Three Deuces in Chicago. When I heard him at the Three Deuces, I said, my God Almighty, what that man is doing. When he played his run, he'd be a B flat, an A flat, and a G flat. And the next note would be a D. Now the thumb glissed across, played a D and a C, and then he was back to his B flat again. And he goes, and he's going down, and he's playing that run, and he plays flat hand piano. So he's not playing this way, he's playing down like this. So no matter how close you look at Art, the hand looks almost motionless. So you just hear, and you're hearing a million notes, and his hands aren't moving at all. They just went from here to there. The one thing you will know is when he goes, think, and he goes up and hits that note, and goes, boom. That you will notice. Or if he reaches for his handkerchief and he's making a gigantic run, right? Those things.
The father of stride piano was, in most pianists' judgment, James P. Johnson. And he was the one who made the leap from what had been Scott Joplin's ragtime into something entirely different. This became what has since been called stride piano. The left hand was lengthened. The stride physically was greater. And often contain a counter melody in the bass notes to something else. For example,
people like James P. and others, Willie the Lion, certainly exemplified that style. They were the transitional players, and of course then Fats Waller came along, and then Tatum, because you hear a lot of Fats Waller stride in Tatum's stride. This is one of Fats Waller's compositions you might recognize, you know.
when Tatum got to it, it became less deliberate, less obvious, more flowing still, and began to take on dimensions in the right hand, which were something that hadn't been heard much before. If he were to be playing that same Ain't Misbehavin', it would come out more like this.
There's no place that my father, club that Art Tatum worked, that my father would come in and he wouldn't ask my father to play, and vice versa. There's no place that my father be working and he see Art Tatum come in the club that he couldn't play. One time in the club, he said, when Art Tatum came in the club, he said, God's in the house. So he had a whole lot of respect for him. Tiny Grimes, the guitar player that played with my father and Art Tatum, told me that they were the two greatest jazz piano players that ever lived. My father and Art Tatum.
That was the roots to come from in those days. Stride piano players. They were piano players that played the entire orchestra. Because they had been playing in places like where, not ballrooms, but they've been playing in apartment houses where you go by house flats in Chicago was loaded with that. Where you have a flat where the guys come by after hours and you can buy some food and meet some nice ladies and sit around the dining room and eat and drink and have a lovely time. And they had a piano player in the corner. So he had to play the whole bit. There wasn't room for a clarinet or a saxophone or a bass. So you stride, he played the whole thing.
Toledo, Ohio. I imagine I was about 4 or 5 years old at the time, and I couldn't relate exactly as to what he was doing, but then as I grew older, I understood what he was doing. Of course, he's much older than I am, and I realized because I would hear him playing, he and his friends would come in and they'd be playing the piano, and then I realized that he was going to be a talent. My mother was born in Virginia, my father in North Carolina, but they came there at young ages. My father played a little piano, a little ragtime, but nothing basic. There was always music in the house, radio or the roller piano. They spent a small fortune sending him to a blind handicapped school in Columbus, Ohio. And he developed this talent as he progressed year by year. They fostered it, you know, if they saw he could do something. I imagine someone said, hey, let him play the piano, okay? He had a teacher, Mr. Ramey, piano teacher, who helped him with his initial basics. But after that, it was he on his own. He started getting work in the clubs. He followed Teddy Wilson. Teddy Wilson was the house pianist and band for Lou Greiner. And then Teddy left, and then Art took over his position. Toledo was one of the most unusual cities at that time. There was no racial conflict there. Never has been in Toledo, Ohio. That was unusual in Ohio at the time. He played there about 5 years, 4 to 5 years, and then he got this opportunity with Adley.
One night of bliss, one stolen kiss is thrilling me yet. Why should it be unlucky me? One night of bliss, one stolen kisses.
It was a great thrill for the family to know that he was working with Adley Hall. She responded to him and he responded to her. And I think they had a good relationship, which was going to be terminated eventually anyway because of his popularity and things like that. But they had a good relationship. And he always spoke well of Adley and her, the opportunity that she gave him to be known and to perform.
It became evident that he was a star in his own right because he drew a great deal of applause for his solo performances during the Adelaide Hall singing performances. And in 1933, he did make his first records for Brunswick, which were solos. There were 4 records made at that time. And they took the music world by storm. Certainly the jazz musicians were overwhelmed to find this tremendous talent. And they really didn't know where it had come from or who his inspirations were. He himself has stated that Fats Waller was his primary inspiration. There was a piano player named Lee Sims who exerted a great deal of influence on him with his harmonic style. Sims was not a jazz performer, but he had some interesting ideas of harmony and had written a book on the subject. Those players who were the prominent figures in stride piano, like James P. Johnson and people like Earl Hines and others, were astonished at his facility and the new harmonies that he brought into the music, the rhythmic intensity and complexity of the music. And he continued to be a solo performer of some considerable note in those days.
Tatum could play a tune for half an hour and never play the same thing twice. Play a tune for half an hour and never play the same chorus twice. He'd never make the mistake of making the same run twice. His mind would always be thinking. He could just sit up for half an hour, 45 minutes, play a tune, and every time he'd come around, he'd be playing something else. He's a fantastic man.
Tatum's greatness, I think, is grounded first, and this may be surprising because many people would say first in his technique. I don't think so. I think first in his ability as a musician to do what Waller did in a different way, to create improvisations that were almost limitless in their inventiveness. Lots of different tricks, I think, are in Tatum's vocabulary as they were in Waller's vocabulary. By that I mean not stride tricks, not decorative figures that are applied to a melodic line, but ways of going up and down the keyboard, of using patterns of runs, 5, 6 note runs repeated over and over, way up and down the keyboard, using the whole extent of the keyboard. And what Tatum does is to apply these in different situations, the way Waller did in his, but with an enormous amount of variety and inventiveness all over the keyboard. Rhythmically, he's completely unpredictable. Harmonically, he enriches the language that Waller bequeathed to him to the same extent that Waller enriched the language that was likewise bequeathed to him. In other words, it's taken that much further. The way he alters chords and transposes a phrase in the middle of the phrase is shocking and new, and yet somehow it's right. It works. He certainly defined, however, what great piano jazz playing would be for the boppers. Clearly one had to have a flawless technique. Waller did, but Tatum's technique was even greater than Waller. And I didn't mean to suggest when I said that I don't find that his technique is the most important thing about him, that it wasn't important. He couldn't have done anything he did without having that enormous fluency. Tatum's technique was universally regarded as the most prodigious, the finest, the most powerful, and still is, I think, today. People regard him as an outsized pianist, a pianist whose technique is beyond imitation. It's anyone who hears Tatum for the first time simply wonders, how does he move his fingers so fast? Because they literally fly over the keyboard. They're a blur. There are ways to learn how to do his runs, but they involve cheating, using just these 3 fingers all the time, up and down the keyboard. When Waller heard Tatum play, there obviously would have been an element of competition involved, but having heard Tatum, I think Waller recognized that Tatum indeed was the genius that he was proclaimed to be, that no other pianist could really touch him as a technician and as a musician in many ways. But Tatum's basis, too, is also stride. And again, occasionally, even in some of the most mind-boggling and complex improvisations on the standard repertoire that Tatum does, you will suddenly hear just a bit, a very small bit of stride, but it's there. It says to a listener, these are my roots, this is where I came from. That tradition is passed even further beyond Tatum to Thelonious Monk, oddly enough. Perhaps the most avant-garde pianist of his day, the most experimental, the most likely to do things that even other jazz musicians would find difficult to accept.
Tatum's harmonies, when he doubled up and quadrupled up the passing tones from, instead of doing that, if he that sort of thing was, in one aspect, what Charlie Parker brought to jazz quite a bit later. Parker's innovations were so universal that they affected every player of every instrument. It's clear that Parker was familiar with what Tatum had done on the piano, and I think it's easy to say that Tatum's harmonic knowledge opened up Parker's and showed him the way. And then also, just the very rapidity with which Tatum played was something that Parker seemed to be trying to do. And with Tatum, when fast, flighty things like that, you hear Bird playing that way often, little rapid notes and connecting things, because Tatum wasn't only doing these patterns. He wasn't doing only those runs and things I was showing before. He would actually get into a single tone line by combining them all and running from one to another. Which was getting to be very close to what Parker was developing, or would develop somewhat later. Oscar Peterson is the pianist who, when he wishes to, can probably come closest to Tatum's command of the instrument. Oscar, of course, plays a great many different ways, but Oscar, among other things, can replicate Tatum's style very well, and he has a marvelous technique, and he can do that. And also, Oscar, unlike some other pianists, cares about playing solo piano, as well as he plays with accompaniments such as Ray Brown and so forth. He also is a marvelous solo pianist.
Tatum was staying at a hotel on 8th Avenue. I think it was the Braddock, an old beaten-up hotel. I don't know why he stayed there. Perhaps because there was no other hotel available. But anyway, he stayed there, and he was working at the Three Deuces down on 52nd Street. But during this period, I had become friendly with Tatum in Buffalo, New York, just prior to coming to New York. He used to play at a club up there called McVan's, and we used to always go there and hear his last set after we finished playing up there. But anyway, when we came to New York, Tatum would have this habit of going to all the after-hour spots that he could find, you know, wherever there was a piano, that's where he would go. So one night, he wanted to go to this club, and so he said, hey, let's go there. So I took him there. He couldn't see very well, you know. So we went down there, and when we got there, there was Marlowe Morris, who was a fairly big name in New York at the time, as a stride piano player and whatever. Teddy Wilson, I believe, was there. Oh, there were about 10 or 15 pianists there, and they all played. And Tatum, I don't know how he did it, but he inveigled me to get up there and play. I had no business even in there, you know, with all these great pianists. And then after that, Tatum got up and played. And as usual, he just made a complete He washed the term is, you've heard the term, washed everybody away. He washed everybody away. The slate was clean, you know. And of course, he did some phenomenal things, as he always did whenever he sat down to the piano. The man was incredible. And you forgot about everything else that had happened before that. He had this unique ability. He had this unique touch to get the most out of any instrument. And there are very few pianists who can do that. He could, for instance, play on a piano that was, let's say, considerably less than perfect, you know, which means it was a rotten piano. But he could take a piano like that and make it sound like a Baldwin concert grand.
We're in a joint one night, and there was 5 keys sticking down, and we're under a mortuary, okay? And we had to walk by a guy that was on a drain board. And he said to me, "What do I smell?" I says, "That's formaldehyde." I says, we're en route through a mortuary, but we're gonna jam in the back. Now this particular night, it was Chitterson was playing the piano, Herman Chitterson. And Art says, "That's a lousy piano." And Chitterson's going like this, and some of the keys aren't going down, so there's some teeth missing in what he's playing. So Art say, "Now that's an F sharp, and that's a B natural, that's a D, da-da-da-da." He'd name them, and they're all over the piano. And Art would say, "Get me another beer." So he'd get about 4 beers in him, and he'd say, "All right, take me up there." And this always knocked me out, because you hand him a beer, he'd take a drink and then he'd tap it, and he knew what key it was in, and he'd know how much beer he had left. But now, with all the keys going down, when Art played a run, he went with this hand and pulled the keys up. So as he was going down with this hand, all the keys are back ready to play again with this hand. So when he come up, the keys were in shape. Then he's down here pulling the keys up with this hand. Well, this just shocked everybody, because, you know, to remember 5 keys and to have them up so you could hit them again, you have to be pretty alert, pretty sharp. And Art was that.
He had a phenomenal mind for sports. He could quote you batting averages of players you never even heard of. He had a phenomenal memory for things like that. He was very interested in sports, all sports. He loved baseball, you know, hockey, basketball. He knew all the statistics. He knew all the players, you know. He was really quite a person.
I played cards with him. He liked to play pinochle. And then we would sit down in between sets at night in the intermission. He would put a very strong light behind his left side. And he would, this is an eye, I guess he could see better out of the left one. and we would deal the cards, and he would take the cards and put them up to his eye and put them all in place, and exactly where the cards were supposed to be. And then he never looked at it again. You had to call your card when you played it. You say, Jack of spades, you know, and he'd reach and put the queen on it if you had the queen. But it was amazing. Every night, that's what we did our pastime in 1935. So I really got to know him and have a lot of fun with him.
Really a musician's musician in every way, caused many pianists to reconsider, played rarely with others, had a tendency to sort of slow down and simplify his style when he played with other musicians. He was somewhat inhibiting, but he did form a trio in 1943 with Slam Stewart and Tiny Grimes, and that started in Los Angeles, where they used to jam after hours at an upstairs club for free. And then lines began to form, people coming to hear them. They had to get chains and put them out in front of the restaurant. And eventually they decided to do a tour with the trio, and they again had a tremendous impact. In those days, there weren't very many concert recital hall opportunities for a pianist who played jazz. And the places that were available were small, dingy, dark, dank, often seedy, not very large. And it was really not possible to get the kind of exposure that one would get, but nevertheless, there were opportunities that did turn up. Rudy Valley, an old-time singer who was also a saxophone player, had Tatum on his show in 1934, I believe. And he did appear on the Kraft Music Hall radio program and on a number of other radio programs.
I understand that Art is quite a favorite with some of the biggest concert pianists, too.
You better take that kind of easy. I'm not a concert pianist. I mean, I don't accept that.
Come on, Art. Okay. Why don't you tell the folks something about the piano you have at home? I understand it's a pretty important item in the Tatum household, isn't it?
Yes, I have a good Steinway. I've had it for about 9 years since I've had my house. And that, incidentally, was the first thing to come in the house was a piano.
Well, that was certainly a wonderful write-up you had in Time magazine a couple of months ago, Art. Let's see now, how long have you been playing piano?
Well, you're going to make me tell my age. I've been playing quite a while. I'll say over 20 years anyway.
The Dorsey brothers were friends of his, and he did appear in the Dorsey brothers film, mid-40s, called The Fabulous Dorseys. And the band included the Dorsey brothers, Charlie Barnett, Ziggy Elman, and some others of note.
I think, was basically an embellisher and an improviser on music of other people. And the music that he used was popular songs of the day or previous days, and occasionally classical themes too, which he must have come in contact with when he was a child and was studying. He had a classical upbringing, and I think it's clear that a lot of that came through in his playing.
He mixed stride and classical, and then he had that ability that other pianists just didn't have. The mind. He could do things very quickly with his mind and his brain. And he could improvise, and he could do things that they just couldn't do. No way they could do it, because they weren't him. You know what I mean? They just weren't Art Tatum. And that's the way the cookie goes. They weren't him.
After the show was over, that's when you'd catch Art at his best. When Art would sit there with only 3 or 4 people in the club and sing. And he sang great. And he loved to sing blues early in the morning. And I might say that Art was a very lovable, gentle guy.
Sesame old train, crude old engineer, sesame old train, crude old engineer, sesame old train, took my baby away from here. Said, I got something to tell you, baby, make the hair rise on your head. Got something to tell you, baby, make the hair rise on your head. Said, I got something to give you, sugar, make the springs crawl on your bed.
I took my brother to hear him one night in Chicago. It was at the Brass Rail. And I said, you're going to hear the greatest piano player in the world. And my brother's sitting there with his wife and Mary and I, and we're sitting there, and Tatum comes up and he goes, wham! And the people applaud. So my brother turned around to look and see who came in. And I said, what are you looking for, Ralph? And he says, somebody must have come in. I heard them all applauding. And I says, no, they were applauding at what Art played on the piano. And my brother says, well, what I heard him play on the piano is like when your mother made you dust the keys on the piano with a rag. That stuck with me all my life. There isn't much difference between just taking your finger and running them all down the black keys, and you got one hell of a run, okay? And there it is, it's just a gliss down the piano. But it sounds, to a layman, A layman doesn't know if this is hard to do or easy to do. And consequently, this is one of the drawbacks that a great person is going to have, that the more talented he is, the thinner the air gets. When you have that ability, it's very hard to restrict yourself to play something as stupid as the melody. If you want to be rich and you want to please a lot of people, you have to give the people what they can understand, what they can digest. And of course, that means that you have to play a simple kind of music.
Gonna tell you, baby.
He died in 1956 of uremic poisoning, kidney failure. He had been ill for perhaps a year prior to that time. But he played right up until a couple of weeks before his death. And then he had to give up the tour and go back to California, where he lived, entered the hospital. He died almost immediately thereafter.
Anyone that thinks a musician has it easy, they're just kidding themselves. It's kind of hectic. It's kind of hectic because you're doing a Tuesday to, say, Saturday or Sunday booking. Then you got to leave out of there and go to the next booking. And you're riding planes. Basically, that's your mode of transportation, the plane. You got to go in the bad weather and the good weather. He would stay out practically all night. That's his part of him.
The funeral itself brought out a whole host of musicians involved in jazz. People like Sarah Vaughan and Ella Fitzgerald. Ben Webster was there, and many other notables in the world of jazz.
I'm gonna sing this bird.
When I hear something that I think is wonderful, I want to compare it to something, I take out my Tatum records and play it. If I think something is really new and rare and unusual, a player, not only a pianist, but any instrumentalist, and I say, well, let me just go back, because we haven't heard art in a long, long time now. He's been gone. So the sound is not immediately in our ear. And when we hear something new, we say, well, I just want to check the balances on it. It brings me back to what it's like. Ben Webster did the same thing. He was a great worshiper of Art Tatum. He was a leader. Harmonically, these things that people are saying that he played too many notes, all of these things harmonically is what everybody else has been striving to do. They just haven't been able to work it out like Art did. He sat at the piano and played it. It didn't hardly look like his hands were moving. And he was playing notes that, in harmonic structure, the balance in the harmonic way, and the softness and the touch that he had. It's mind-boggling. Really, I've sat down with Ben Webster, listened to Art Tatum's recordings, and we've cried. Just the two men sitting there listening to the beauty and the power and the fleetness of this man.
There isn't a piano player probably in the whole world that doesn't have his picture on the wall and say, I wonder how he did that. And I sat there and watched him. And I'm looking at those hands go down, and no matter how much, and I can take a piano roll, slow it down, and watch the keys go down real slow. And then you still can't figure out how he did it.